So today, of course, at all times, I'm ready to switch over to another screen or menu. We can talk about and pursue rigorously some of the implications of anything that may have come up or may have failed to come up. Nonetheless, I've prepared to disrupt the letter's itinerary, unless this is part of the letter's trajectory, to detour and deviate and think the test with you, and also the technology of testing and what it might be to test to failure, and certain re-significations or reconceptualizations that technology teaches us in certain ways. So it's very hard to condense and to retrieve from memory a book that burdened me for years, and that is called The Test Drive, in which I tried to consider a modality of being that, among other things, displaces the ostensibly sovereign place of truth. There's something about testing and our adherence and attachment and bless you, a need for testing things out. And it's spread in ways that perhaps haven't really been cataloged. That has interested me, among other things, and you can help me think this through, because I put a fade out on this book that as I said, held me hostage for a long time. I don't even remember what forced my hand, why it befell me, why it called me. I don't know about you and how you choose your projects or objects or themes. Maybe you don't know about you and how you choose your projects and objects and themes and topoi. But as an obsessional neurotic certified here, let us continue. I receive orders from in a certain way that I'm not loath to share with you, though it's usually packed away in a secret compartment. For example, I open Nietzsche and he says, someone has to write about our modernity as a narcotic phenomenon. And I look at it and I say, oh shit, I don't want to write about that. I have no need to do this. But it's an order, so Ratman, spend the next few years working on addiction, narcotics. I become my own narcotics bureau. And have my own internal dogs tracking the drugs and drug culture and so on and so forth. Before you know it, not before you know it, quite a while afterwards, there's a book on addiction and mania and something else. Literature, of course. So, and how one, in the case of Madame Bovary, she smoked literature, she injected it, she ate it, she devoured it, and I tried to pursue the economies of her destructive jouissance as she's pushed beyond the pleasure principle in certain ways. So then, finally, I get this off my back, this monkey off my back, and I read one day very calmly Deleuze, who says, why has no one written about on the transcendental concept of stupidity? And I'm like, oh shit, I don't want to work on stupidity. But I was forced. I I was coerced by this encounter. So I received my orders from all sorts of places. I can't remember what forced my hand to write or why testing befell me, but it became my project and object. But for all sorts of reasons, it could be because I was reading Husserl, and at one point he breaks off his text enigmatically on the word test. He just stops. And very often I like to go in where stuff stops speaking to us, or where there's disruption. I try to read the interruption, or what's no longer offered except as a smear, a blur, barely a trace of some sort of catastrophe, maybe, in a work. So I realized that for the test drive I would have to have a section on Husserl, but I told this to a colleague. He said, "Oh, you're not going to bore the shit out of us with another thing on Husserl." Never good to, usually I'm very guarded, I don't know about you guys, with my work. It's not good to, too vulnerable, and so he kind of ruined it, but out of the ruins I decided that I would do something different with Husserl, namely I would become Husserl, and do what my friend Kathy Acker sometimes did, which is impersonate or steal the identity of someone. Now, stealing Husserl's identity is something you've got to experience once in a lifetime, because he has no personality. And he leaves very few traces. I had a very painful encounter with Derrida on the subject of this, and here's something that I might tell you. We were having lunch in New York, and before he was leaving, and I said to him, "You know, I've decided to become Husserl, but the problem is that there's very little of a autobiographical trace. So I have to deduce from his work, which is doesn't lend itself to this, and there's nothing. He's so discreet that there's hardly anything about himself." And then you see Derrida looking at me in shock and disbelief, and I could see him saying, "Who is this idiot?" You know? And I go, "What's the problem?" He goes, "Nothing," because he was very clear on being the master and that he could crush anyone with, you know, the wrong move. So I could see a sudden Botox paralysis to avoid, extinguishing me on the spot. I go, "No, what's wrong? I can see that you're not happy with my project." He said, "No trace of an autobiography?" And I go, "Nothing. There's some correspondence in the Marbach archive." Marbach. So he heard Rousseau. And I'm speaking in French, so that traumatized me. I still can't pronounce the name of Husserl in French. Can anyone hear? It sounds to them, it sounds like Rousseau. Yeah, it sounds like Rousseau. So in any case, you may know that Rousseau was practically an exhibitionist about his life and couldn't shut up. At the end of the Confessions, for God's sake, it's called the Confessions, he says, "I have nothing more to say, I'm done." 10 minutes later, the reveries, that's it. I'm done talking about myself, exposing myself, making a fool of myself. Okay, that's it, I'm closing shop. A year later, well, there's some other crime I committed that I should really confess to you all. So Rousseau can't shut up, and Derrida's hearing, well, Rousseau never left a trace, you know, and so there was that horrible moment that I have on flashback in me.
How did you figure it out? When did he finally figure it out?
He didn't, I did, because he was withholding his horror, but I could, you know, as a good paranoid person, I could tell something was off. And finally I said, then I gave the titles of Husserl's work. But it went on forever. It could have been because I said, you've written about him. Yeah, I know. Have you read it? I go, of course I've read it. What is this? Then finally, and then it was just a horror when you see your teacher look at you like you're a total idiot, and how could they not have known? Go into that, but this is all an aside. I took on the personality, such as it is, of Husserl, but that allowed me to attack myself. Husserl has a lot to do with my so-called method. I mean, he has a lot to say about it, but you should know that one quality of the obsessional neurotic and why it's linked to philosophical and critical thought by Freud is self-criticism, biting self-criticism. So I've always wanted to, it's always been a dream of mine to, and a desire, to write something that would shoot me down. But Nietzsche did that, and it stuck, so it's a dangerous, risky thing, because you may not want to put yourself up against the wall like that. So I'm still thinking about it. But by becoming Husserl, I could, as Husserl, address Derrida's writing on Husserl and express some concern about the work that I'm doing. And that gave me that kind of neurotic pleasure. I don't know if you can identify with that or not. Nonetheless, what testing allowed me to do is to find different modalities of being that displace truth, as I say, and that becomes a certain replacement part for our relatedness to truth. It also involves probability, living the hypothetical, all of these types of existential grammars of behavior and being are inflected in different ways once you circuit them through what has become a kind of extreme power of testing. You test someone's love, you test someone's loyalty. There are loyalty tests, pregnancy tests, there are athletic contests and tests, as we started hinting by Benjamin. There are, you test friendship, for example, and this is where Nietzsche comes in, who threw himself into modalities of self-testing that I try to track. And one of the greatest, he says that the great legislators of thought are those who risk the test. That's almost a tautology, because test is risk. You have in Shakespeare testing your mettle. In other words, there's a kind of displacement of and recovery of something like self-knowledge that can only occur as an effect of crashing against walls of experience and testing limits. What does it mean to test limits and take risks, and so on and so forth? This is very different, as you can hear from the dynamics, the temporality implied, from asserting the truth. In other words, with the hypothetical incursion, that testing, was also interested in the Protestant, the test in Protestant, because Protestantism is also thinking of Herman Cohen and Luther and others. That's testing Christianity in certain ways that I try to explore. So the hypothetical is something that rides on its own provisionality and wants to be verified, but in a way that might collapse at any moment. This is a different relation to time and being in time, and I can't reduce it, but I hope I give you a little sense of it. There's the question also of friendship, And there I kind of ride from Derrida's Politics of Friendship. But in English, you say something that you don't say in other languages that I know. Correct me if I'm wrong. But in English, you actually make friends. So I was interested also in the performativity of the making of friendship and what that means. In Japanese or Korean? Korean, you make friends? Yay, okay, Korean is great. How do you say? Okay, so I'm very interested in... How? You do? On se fait des amis. Okay, then, I don't even remember. But in any case, the making of friends, thank you for reminding me of Korean, Italian, and French. What the performativity of making friends and the kind of testing that's involved might be. So I'm kind of stuttering around a huge work, and count on you to fill in some blanks, to read the work with me, to consider what the absence of a test would be, and how testing, in a sense, abominates the what is. It's a kind of ontological insurrection. Like, once you introduce, which I feel has become the case, the almost hegemony, that's not part of my vocabulary, but nonetheless, of testing, the what is destabilizes, because you're now in the realms of the hypothetical, that which does not have stable or solid grounding, but requires some sort of movement of erasure or self-erasure, or possibly destruction, because testing is related to destruction. When you test something out, when you do hit a limit, that means something catastrophic and collapsing might occur. Now, there's different types of utterances associated with testing, and one that I wanted to jam on at the time was what it means when someone says, try me. You know, try me. That's part of tryouts and so on, trial, ordeal. I mean, there's a vocabulary of the test, examination, auditions, demos, things that are kind of requiring or inviting a certain imposition of evaluation, judgment. Nothing is, I mean, even the Son of God, according to the New Testament, was tested at certain moments. Abraham, Job was the testee. So I looked at many different test narratives that we've inherited and that immemorially continue to run through our programs. Job, when he was tested, the great celebrity of being tested, invented the contestation, a very specific type of contestation which belongs in certain ways to the fact of being tested, which is to try to resist it, to throw it off. So Abraham, of course, was tested. God was, according to that narrative, wanted Abraham to give up the most valuable thing to him in order to prove his loyalty to Yahweh, to God, right? So he was tested to see if he could slaughter his son. the question with Job is the great contester. He's not happy with it. Abraham responds differently, as you know. He submits, he's silent. The walk up Mount Moriah is a very silent one. And Isaac asks no questions. So it's a non-contested demande or test. Now, one of the questions that arises is, did Abraham know that he was being tested? If he knew it were a test, such as when you hear on broadcast systems, this is just a test. So the just a test changes the relation to testing. This is just a test of the emergency broadcast system, right? It's only a test. But I wanted to zoom in on the only a test, because nowadays, what is not a test? Now, this is the 10th anniversary coming up of 9/11, when, I don't know if you remember, there was someone at the helm purportedly named George Bush. He came out finally of hiding and silence, and he said, our nation is being tested. So of all the utterances he could have chosen, he said, our nation is being tested. He chose, or was prompted to say, that this is all about the test. However, his rhetorical use of the test was kind of abusive, to the extent that the test is kind of open-ended, troubling, but he was mixing up the technological and the biblical, let's say, vectors of what testing could mean, because when he was saying we are being tested, he meant we've already passed the test. He has passed the test because he was elected, which he wasn't. But there's a way of now asking, will one have, if you knew it's a test, is it a test? We'll see. I'm going to try to make this clear. Rousseau, not Husserl, gives us an example. He lived with an older woman that he called Maman, that he loved, and she was kind of concerned one day that he wasn't getting a job. He was kind of just hanging out in her house. So she sent him to visit the village chaplain, or such a figure, to find out, kind of, to take a vocational test or something, to find out what he might be good at, so she could encourage him to get out of the house once in a while and maybe contribute to their household, such as it was. So he writes about this, of course, as he writes about everything, and everything's a big trauma, and everything was, you know, he was messed with and tripped up. And he explains, he said he thought he was going on a social visit. He thought he was invited. It was pure hospitality to have coffee or tea with the village chaplain, to hang out and to chat. But had he known that this was a test, he would have behaved very differently. And so he's outraged that he was blindly, and there's the question of the blind test too, he was blindly subjected to a testing apparatus without his permission or consent. So the question arises, oh, by the way, the chaplain told Maman that he was useless. Forget about it. He will not do anything. He can't be a carpenter, he can't be, you know, a rock and roll singer, nothing. Forget it. You're living with a guy who will be forever a parasite. Try to embrace it and get over yourself. That is the nature of your couple. Okay, just get with that program, because nothing's going to change this. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. By the way, Rousseau wrote a thing called Jean-Jacques Judges Rousseau. So he fulfilled one of those fantasies, so does Nietzsche, of launching a great nuclear attack against himself and blowing up his own oeuvre. Nietzsche and Rousseau, by the way, had the same insight of the kind of emptiness underneath it all, but Rousseau freaked out about it, and Nietzsche danced on it. You know, that they had a different disposition toward the same insight. Rousseau was absolutely crestfallen, and Nietzsche said, I'm going to affirm life with this nothingness and wholeness. So there's the same insight with a different disposition, and what an interesting historical mood irony that it would be the Germanic who affirms with dancing and music life, and the more Franco, Genevois, the Genevan French side of things that has that kind of Germanic sense of heaviness about his insight. So Rousseau raises the question for us, among other things, he makes it clear, though you see it everywhere, if you know you're being tested, is it a test? Or is the nature of the true or genuine test to be trailing you when you don't know that you're being tested? What's the temporality of true testing? Wouldn't it have to be that you will have been tested? This is the future anterior that Derrida likes to use. In the future past, you will have known that you were, or you will have been tested. So it has a different temporality that we should be attentive to. If you know, if you're told God is testing you or you are being tested, then it's not truly a test. But when George Bush said our nation is being tested, he scrambled the master codes of two types of testing and meant, I'm being tested, that means I've been chosen to have already passed this test. You see, and that kind of empowered me with a transcendental prompter and backup crew. If it were truly a test, it means we really don't know the outcome, nor is the temporality of knowing assured or guaranteed in any way. When does a test or the hypothetical movement of testing end? Of course, there are different types of tests and the way you test yourself or push yourself. And to get back momentarily just to try me, how does that work? Because that's a minimal utterance that we could jam on together. When someone says, try me, it seems like it comes in the guise of a kind of hospitality. Sure, try me. Give me a chance or try me. It's at once, I would think, a red light and a green light, right? Let's see how far you can get. Test my limits, meaning I will destroy you if you test yourself through me or if I become the object of testing for you. Just try me. Let's see how far you can get. So I'm interested in these kinds of utterances that are pervasive and that are bizarre. It's a way of, so from this, again, it's kind of, this is the procedure that I try to follow, which is instead of head-on attacking truth and the truth banners that are still being waved around and in our faces, I try to see what the displacements are. And this seems kind of manageable and minor, but once you start thinking about testing and the way intelligibility works or unworks itself under the regime of testing, something breaks open and breaks down as well. So I've just condensed thousands of pages and maybe into an incomprehensible garble. Does anyone know what I wrote in there, or would you have questions or something? Because then we have here where we're going to Kafka's parable called Die Prüfung, which is another kind of test that I want to to go on with you. But the major, now I remember that one major part of the book, again, prompted by Nietzsche and Husserl, is Nietzsche's breakup and ethics of breakup with Wagner, and what it meant for Nietzsche to have to test himself against his friend and master, Wagner, and decide he had to give him up. Because the test, when you self-test, according to Nietzsche, first of all, that means that you are a legislator and not just a noble describer, as he says Kant and Hegel are. The one who gives oneself, one owes oneself the gift of self-testing, says Nietzsche. So that's an interesting structure as well. It's a gift you give to yourself. This is your duty toward yourself, according to Nietzsche, is to test yourself against anything that you might be attached to. So anything you might be attached to, rather than inviting a fusional merger, requires you to test yourself and the limits of your attachment and to disidentify with that onto which you were holding. For him, it was time, I mean, he says something very interesting, and he says that for Shakespeare, the most important character is Brutus. And Hamlet is just a sniveling little neurotic, says Nietzsche, but Brutus is the man. Brutus is the one who, and you know, Nietzsche says the proof for this, that Shakespeare was on his knees in front of Brutus, bowing before Brutus the entire time, and absolutely subjugated by the grandeur of and the sublimity of Brutus, is that he named the play Julius Caesar. I'm going, oh, that's the proof? You see, there's something going on that's a little weird, you know, but because Shakespeare could not avow that Brutus was his main man. And what did Brutus accomplish? Brutus separated off from Caesar, says Nietzsche, his most beloved, his master, his teacher, his companion, his father, adopted father. But what's interesting about that moment is that Caesar is the name of the cut, isn't it? Like a C-section. So Caesar, a Caesarean, Caesar becomes the name of the cut that Nietzsche travels into and says this is the most glorious and most highly invested figure in all of Shakespeare. So one wants to know why this is so. And in fact, Nietzsche puts him up there with Mohammed, with Jesus Christ, with Plato, with a great list of celebrity thinkers and prophets. Brutus is right up there. So for Nietzsche to break up with Wagner was a test, because this is Nietzsche, don't forget. So he has to figure out a way to break up and out without ressentiment. What's a Nietzschean breakup? He's not going to sing a somebody done somebody wrong song. That's not Nietzsche. You know, he's not going to say, nor is he going to be in bad faith, like, I'm not good enough for you. That's not Nietzsche either. Nietzsche has to stay true to Nietzsche. He can't say, you've done me wrong, you've done me harm, because that then breeds ressentiment. Nor can he say, I'm a piece of shit, so I'm going to let you live your glorious life. There had to be a noble way to break off from the most loved. And it was hard for Nietzsche because Nietzsche loved Wagner to death. And so he tested himself out by writing several times the breakup text, Nietzsche contra Wagner, right? He kept on writing books in order to break up with Wagner, but even dedicating one of his books to Voltaire was a slap in Wagner's face, because Nietzsche is suddenly going French, which was the enemy of Wagner. Nietzsche is suddenly appreciating the enemy. But someone said to Nietzsche, well, whom do you love now? And he said, you're getting it all wrong. Wagner was a windfall in my life. No one he's irreplaceable. This is not about kicking him to the curb. It's something about self-testing that requires me to break off with Wagner, who is irreplaceable and remains the gift and the joy and the light of my life. But there's a moment when Nietzsche was Wagner's first cheerleader, by the way, in Bayreuth, because I was thinking for Nietzsche, Bayreuth is bereits bereut. It means I really regret that I had anything to do with Bayreuth. So that was the first Woodstock music. This is when everyone was supposed to come, and it was the biggest media event imaginable. It was the first part of a Gesamtkunstwerk, the totality of art, state, nation, aesthetics, technology. Wagner's the first to shove the orchestra into the pit, making it a kind of telephone, because you hear the orchestra differently. We're accustomed to it, but Wagner did all sorts of things that were also nationally and nationalistically described. So Nietzsche was the first and only cheerleader, and then he noticed that this music itself created what Lacoulabart calls a kind of national aestheticism, and it pumped up the nation and was vulgar, and he had to break off with Wagner, because Wagner was hardening into an arrogant, anti-Semitic, racist, intolerable icon. So this is something I analyze, and I would try to analyze with you how Nietzsche breaks off from Wagner.
I have a question.
Yes?
So how much of it was Nietzsche protesting Wagner's decadence and Nietzsche's need to individuate from Wagner as a parent figure?
Yeah.
How much is it about equal, or does it, or?
Well, this is what is tremendous about Nietzsche, that he never considered, he kept intact the asymmetry, and he insisted on that, and that would be part of the ethics of the breakup. But when they were together, so to speak, if you look at some of the notes that Wagner sent Nietzsche, Wagner said, hey, as long as you're going downtown, can you buy the Christmas gifts for my family? And I need a new pair of underwear. And as long as you're at it, could you rewrite Schopenhauer as educator, because you forgot to mention me? So you have this, kind of nagging partnership going on, and Nietzsche was happy to serve. This is what today's about. Service, the servant as the one being tested, because there is that hierarchical setup and disposition, like of the one being tested is the one also who goes through the experience of extreme and radical subjection to the other, whatever the other would be. Thank you for this brilliant and necessary nudge that you asked. So Nietzsche needed to perform a Nietzschean break. It wasn't about individuating. He refused to think of it that way, but of course one could then ask oneself, and the question, as with Kafka that we're reading, is how do you come up against or fight the power, I know that's old-fashioned, without heralding a parasital banner or rallying the troops? How do you avoid or divert from the parasital path? These are the questions that interest me as well. In other words, how do you break off or break up something without nuking or destroying or demeaning and undermining the other. This is something that I think, now I studied this in another relationship between Goethe and his amanuensis or secretary or TA, RA, assistant, Eckermann. Goethe could have chosen anyone to be his, because all these beautiful guys showed up at his door and said, and pulled out of their asses all their diplomas and all that. And up comes a schizo who walked all the way from Göttingen to Weimar, and he says, I want to be your servant, I want to do whatever you need. You're my God, you're my idol. And Goethe says, you're the one. So my question was, why? You know, in any case, there's a moment, by the way, Eckermann eventually takes over, tells Goethe how to write his autobiography, what to write, what to get rid of. He imitates Goethe's handwriting. He takes over the correspondence. I'm very interested in these kinds of pairings and who helps whom in the textual machinery. And Eckermann was really abjected and disavowed. He lived in a little hut with 40 birds. Now you have to imagine this. He wrote what Nietzsche calls, and Heine and others, the most beautiful work in the German language. They don't say it's Goethe, they say it's Eckermann, this abjection. He wrote in the night, he took dictation, and he had 40 birds, some of which were birds of prey, and they shat on his manuscripts. You have to imagine, and this guy, they say, Eckermann looked like a little bird himself. He had the morphology of a bird. In any case, this was whom Goethe chose. There's one moment, I'm going to get back on track, where I want to show you how Eckermann avoids the parasital track, where he helps Goethe with Goethe's favorite text, which is the theory of color, Farbenlehre, the doctrine of colors. And in the conversations, he describes how they fight for paternity. Who's going to sign this text? This is a problem in collaboration and working together. Whose text is it? The way Eckermann works it out in a Nietzschean way, which is to say, they could have come really to blows over who owns the text, whose property, who's the proper author, question of authorship and so on comes up. And Eckermann does something, a great maneuver, very Freudian, because he says he dictated to Goethe the text, and this is Goethe's pride and joy, you know, and he had Eckermann as some sort of, okay, backup team, now it's yours. So what Eckermann says is, Goethe got very sullen and upset and went to the window and wouldn't speak to me further when I made claims on this text, and kind of answered an implicit paternity suit. But I understood Goethe's movement and withdrawal from me, and my love flowed over me for him, because Goethe was like an unwed mother who was protecting her child, the Farbenlehre. And she, Goethe, had gone through so much in order to shelter this text. So what's brilliant about this maneuver and Freudian is that Eckermann gets, and even Kleinian, because this is repair work. This is great, brilliant repair work. They're fighting over the paternity for the text, who gets to sign. Eckermann, with this maneuver, this strategic and rhetorical maneuver, gets to keep his paternity because Goethe is the mother of the text. She gets to keep her text as well. It's her child. And it's like they were playing chicken, and suddenly the terms are changed. So it's not a parasital collision. It's not I'm the father against the other father, or two great paternal metaphors that are going to clash and crash. It's, right, you're the mother. I don't know if you have all of Freud and Lacan coursing through your heads. This is a brilliant maneuver of avoiding the murderous tracks that literature keeps on laying and philosophy keeps on practicing. There are such maneuvers that I want you just to be attentive to, is how to avoid the patricidal or parasital track, which seems to be the law, which is you have to subdue and overcome and kill the other. That is something that I'm just saying much to a condensed way, trying to answer your important question. So how will Nietzsche avoid taking down Wagner? How will he avoid the murderous path? And you're right, there is some Selbstbehauptung or self-assumption involved. But in Nietzsche, it will always fail. You never become yourself. You never triumph over the other. Like Kafka, you have to, now I'm going to use Lacanian vocabulary momentarily just to fast forward a little. You have to assume your castration. It's not about these George Bushian triumphalists. He messed with my daddy, so I'm going to bomb the shit out of them. It's just, how do you avoid, how do you hold fire is one of the questions that these exemplary writers practice and ask. And that's what the letter to the father, which is a missile of sorts, this is what it struggles with as well. How do I not hit my target? Because I could destroy. This is also, if we were reading Melanie Klein, this is very often the child's, and by the way, the obsessional neurotic's fear is that they could annihilate the father, the friend, the lover, and so on and so forth. So how does one hold back? I know this is very, very quick. Are there any questions so far? And I left off some of the strands. We didn't really jam on try me and what kind of an injunction, an invitation, a hospitality, a threat, a menace. How does that work rhetorically when you say try me? You know, how do you stand your ground? Is that like a line in the sand? Is that, in what ways does tested being crash against the walls of experience? Now, if Abraham knew it was a test, only a test of the emergency divine broadcast system, would he have been able to wink at Isaac or say, just, you know, let's be mellow about this? It may be called off. Now, it could be read that the doubling of this and duplication of this story is the story of Christ on the cross, who thought he was Isaac and being tested, and he's like, whoa, this is really happening. Maybe he didn't say whoa, but he said, why are you abandoning me? I thought we agreed that this was going to be a repeat and rerun of Isaac's sacrifice, where in the last minute, Isaac, as you all know, was substituted for by a ram. So it's as if Christ himself was surprised he wasn't Isaac, and it wasn't a test. The test for Abraham was called off in the last minute, as you know, and then there's a whole question of substitution, sacrifice, and so on. For Christ, it was not called off. So how do you even recognize a test? And if the test is not marked as such, if you're not being told that you're in proving grounds, then the test is everywhere. Now I remember what started me off, which was the technological test that we call the Gulf War. There's no technology that won't be tested, which is to say that the limits between the test and the real really, really are reduced. What is the difference between testing, or like the nuclear test ban treaty, where you try to ban testing, because testing is itself already a provocation and very close to, if not the real deal, of a destructive inscription. So one of my arguments about the Gulf War is that we had a whole arsenal of technologies that had not had their field tests. In other words, they didn't get to be used. And there's no technology that won't be tested or deployed. That was one of my arguments, and I think that's where I took off on the whole adventure of testing and metaphysics of testing, or the breakdown of metaphysics in the face of the necessity of testing. But even at one point, Bush said, I can't call it off anymore, this war. It's going to happen on March such and such. But that's because all of the technology needed to be tested. There's no technology that will not be tested. And in some instances, the test and its referential stronghold can't be distinguished. Like, again, we could go back to what we were talking about in terms of Austin and some of the performatives that fail, or constitutives that fail. When a hostess, let's say in the realm of hospitality, opens the door, you come, and the dog starts gnawing at your ankle, and she says, "Don't worry, he's a friendly dog. He won't hurt you." And it's happening. You know, what part of that is the test of, what part is really happening, what part is a rhetorical distanciation from what's happening. So I know I've just condensed monstrously a lot of possible and popped open files very quickly, and fast forward so that we can attend to this text.
I have
Yes.
a question.
Yes.
That got me thinking when you're talking about the Christ being tested. So therefore, I mean, is it a test? It's almost like that saying, is it a joke if it really happens? Is it a test if he actually dies? So can you clarify maybe the differences?
No, but that's where I wanted to go with this is the grand difference macrostructurally, and thank you for the prompt, that's very helpful, is that you can't fix something like a locus of truth that would beam out and shine out as being identical with itself, because that vacillation and rigorous hesitation is what I'm going after. How do you inhabit the rigorous hesitation? Was that a test, or wasn't it? Was it called off, or did this happen? So there's a traumatic space in which you're not sure. Am I being tested when terrible things happen? One reverts very often to, why am I being tested? What's going on? Or maybe it's not a test, but what would that mean? This is echoing Foucault when he says that madness is the absence of the oeuvre. But what is the absence of a test? Can we even imagine a non-testing ground, a non-proving ground? What interests me is precisely the fragilization, as they say in French, of something like verification, of guaranteed results, of knowing. Of course, there are then other types of tests but these are what disrupt each other, the tests of experts. This has been tested, and so on and so forth. And I want to show how they contaminate each other. But then what happened in the Gulf War when there was an absence of test for a lot of guys, a lot of soldiers, some women, but mostly in the first phase, mostly men? They came back with an illness, an autoimmune disease, but there was no test for it. So and then I do have a lot to say about pharmaceutical and medical discursive formations. If medicine doesn't have a test, then you don't have a disease. So that's something that no insurance, no assurance, someone who has hepatitis F or G, which doesn't exist, maybe nowadays it does, because the test for it isn't there. Notice the movement of logic, of verification and truth-telling. In other words, the test, and it's almost the logic of the paragon that we looked at. The test, which is supposed to be secondary, subservient, and just show you what you have. If the test doesn't pre-exist your symptomal outbreak, you don't have it. You're a hysteric. You're making it up. You're faking it. You're making it up. There's not going to be any excuse for you to stay out of the classroom or out of work. There's no disability that's going to come in and help you, which is going away anyway these days. So absolutely, look at it from the other side, one of the other facets, which is what is the absence of a test? To what extent are we dependent on certain types of tests that make certain kinds of claims that might have a fictional basis, but nonetheless have been authorized rather than deauthorized or something. If you have hepatitis, to stay with that, and I'm not programming it here, A, B, or C, that's recognizable, that's legitimate. So I'm also interested in the way the test or testing cooperates with questions of and the necessity for legitimacy. If you don't test this, it doesn't exist. So why does the test offer the quality of existential solidity, for example? If you don't test this, or if you can't show me how this is tested out, it doesn't exist, has no legitimacy. So these are some of the questions that I try to, those dossiers I open up, and I went way too fast, and if you can offer some of your questions, maybe I can clarify.
Yeah, so I have a question concerning, and you haven't talked much about this, but the twice and then the thrice, the third of the test. You know, God calls Abraham, takes 2 times.
Right.
The first time it's silent, so we have just nothing. And the second time we get a nothing that isn't just nothing. So we kind of have an efficacious nothing. So we have the test sort of existing already as sort of a not and an is, sort of is-not procedure. And then there's the third concerning the site of the test, or the test itself, the test qua subject, the subject of to that is the test, the existence of a test. So I'm wondering just how you might even distinguish that order of the twice of the test, and then we have the question concerning the third.
These are very, very important questions. Every part, even the parts that you didn't think were part of maybe the question. And questioning, to what extent is questioning part of testing, or an offshoot of testing? But what is the test site? That's what was just brought up. That's very important. Why is it that certain third world nations are used as test sites, are abused, are depleted, or the desert that becomes the place for testing, or the oceanic depths and so on. So what is a test site or what is not? Is there a test, like I asked for drugs, is there a drug-free zone? And I tried to show that that's a phantasm. There's no drug-free zone. But what constitutes the test site, or why are there could there be a Nietzschean demand for test sites that would flourish and thrive? Could you imagine a test site that is actually, don't you agree that in our imaginaire collectively, a test site is that where Earth has been polluted and shat upon and stripped of all of its vitality? So what constitutes the test site in the first place? And when Nietzsche says everything is becoming desert, it's a little bit about the way we have tested so far. With Abraham, it's already something, and it's a little controversial because I remember Hamacher disagreed, but I don't know why. God, when he calls out to Abraham, did you work with Hamacher? It was funny, he kept on saying, Abraham, and I said, God says it twice, Abraham, Abraham. He said, not in my version. I go, yeah, he says it twice. So every time, I don't know why I decided to go up against Hamacher in an impish way. So do you know Hamacher, some of you? He's very, very sovereign, Germanic, 20 feet tall. So he goes, Abraham. And then you hear this, Josephine, the singer, Abraham. So I kept on doubling it, In any case, God, and Abraham. So the thing is, why did God need to call out twice? This is part of the call and the question of the call, and is it already part of the testing moment? Let's just pause on this and slow down and back off and say, okay, God, why did you need to call the name of the one to be tested twice? Was the first time not enough? Did God stumble? Is God stuttering? Is God doubling? Maybe there are two Abrahams, as Kafka suggests, that they're split. So why does God have to say Abraham, Abraham? First of all, that's a question as he's calling him. Does Abraham need to be roused twice? Is God not sure? Is he not sure of the destination of the letter, of the call? Does the second time, as usually in the logic of repetition, the second time affirms the first time, so there isn't a twice. Well, there's all sorts of ways to read what is happening when God needs to call Abraham's name twice. So the way it progresses and the way that it's almost like a rocket going up, and you get rid of the boosters because Sarah is a booster. She's excluded from the scene of testing. This is another thing, masculinist testing. Testing is a very masculinist activity. Have you worked with Donna Haraway and in primate visions? She shows how the lab is the testing and the experimenting, and this is what also propelled me, which is what Nietzsche calls the experimental disposition. That's where he sees us. We're always experimenting, and that's our disposition. It's very dangerous, it's very thrilling, it's very life-enhancing to stay with this experimental disposition, but it can always blow up in your face. But in Donna Haraway, where she talks about, and then someone German called Reinberger, where they talk about the lab cultures and how chimpanzees are abused and so on and so forth, and how misogyny has rhetorically and in terms of practice invaded and stuck in the world of experimentation was something that interested me as well. So testing is a very, very masculinist, let's say, it has a masculinist motor. Like, I have to test, which is to say I have to also destroy whatever asserts itself as something stable. I'm not sure about the third phase of testing. What did you mean by that?
Well, I was also, maybe I should have just come out a bit more clear. I mean, the structure of the test is a lot like what we've been talking about with hospitality, or the Lebanesian sort of responsibility. So I was also thinking of the third. I mean, if there are two, there's always a third. So the twice of the silent call, and then the third as the
I see. Oh, okay, that third.
I was kind of thinking of third like that.
My buddy, that third.
That third.
Okay,
Yeah.
I was like, holy shit, the third Trinity. You should have heard my thing go on
Oh,
fast
okay.
forward,
I
you
thought it
know,
would- I didn't wanna-
triangulation.
yeah, I was trying to hide it.
Yeah. Don't hide, why? Because I went through hysterical corridors trying to open the
Oh,
doors, you know, and see which one you were hiding behind. Okay, yeah, no, that's a very good question, which is what would be the thirdness in, and certainly in Abraham, Isaac, and God, that triangulation. God says, if you love me, get rid of her or him, because Isaac is, of course, feminized in certain ways. Get rid of this, I will not tolerate thirdness. God's test is of love and loyalty is get rid of anything or anyone you love, I will not share. So it's you and me, it's the couple. And I'm watching you, and get rid of it and show me that you'll do that without fail, without delay. And Abraham, our psychotic primal father, you know, what is this story? This is our father, of if you belong to or have had anything to do with the three monotheistic religions. There are many, many others, but infanticide is part of the drive of, and the makeup, and the police portrait of primal fathers. You know, that they're the obscene father, let's say, the pre-Oedipal father, who's going to get you, in a sense.